Thanks for joining us. I'm Tom Gjelten of NPR, sitting in for Diane Rehm, who's on a book tour. She'll be back next week. As the New Hampshire primary looms, Republicans brawl over the tactics that were used in the Iowa caucuses. The FBI joins the Flint drinking water investigation, and some good news on wage growth in January's job report. Joining me for the domestic hour of the Friday News Roundup, Gene Cummings of the Wall Street Journal, Olivia Knox of Yahoo News, and Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report. And a good day to each of you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
And we'd like you to join us as we go over this week's news. Call us at 1-800-433-8850. Email us, drshow@wamu.org. You can go to our website. You can find us on Facebook. You can send us a tweet. And one more thing, remember, you can watch us because we're live streaming this hour. It's on our website, drshow.org. Gene, back-to-back encounters between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton this week. As sharp as any that we have seen so far, I think it's fair to say.
Absolutely. They went right at it. Martin O'Malley, not in the middle to get, to create a buffer. That's right. And so they just went straight at each other. It also reflects the Iowa results that were so close.
Mm-hmm.
So Bernie Sanders really wants to win New Hampshire. Hillary Clinton wants to close the gap so she can continue some sort of sense of momentum. So they both have big stakes in New Hampshire. And they also, Bernie Sanders in particular needs to truly define who he is. He's got a lot of energy around him. That's great. But he has to persuade people that he's electable. And that is a high bar. And so he had a separate mission in and of itself when he was in those meetings. The two events were so oddly different, though. The CNN forum was intimate and personal, and questions about what kind of car do you drive, and that sort of thing. That was the town
hall on Wednesday night.
Yeah, that was the town hall. So we really saw two different sides of both of them.
Yeah. Amy, your takeaway? I was caught by this whole battle especially in the early stages of last night's debate over labels. Who gets to call each other a progressive?
Right. I think Gene makes a great point, which is, what the earlier town hall was supposed to be about was, what do voters in the state care about? And it was everything from, what their lives are like, end of life care, to faith issues. This debate was set up, Olivia and I were joking about this earlier, but when you saw the intro to the debate last night, it was basically like, we're going to set these two people up to fight and let's see who comes out at the end. Like, we have a cage match and somebody's going to come out alive, and maybe some of
the moderators didn't intervene. They just let them go at it.
But they basically, it's like having two lions in a pen, and they threw meat out there and then said, go get it. And look, Hillary Clinton, it's clear this is a feistier, more aggressive Hillary Clinton than we've seen. This is a Hillary Clinton that feels backed up against the wall for sure, based on the results in Iowa. She's down anywhere from 20 to 30 points right now in New Hampshire. It was also a Hillary Clinton that was clearly looking beyond New Hampshire. She talked a lot about issues like racial injustice, the fact that she's leaving the campaign trail in New Hampshire to go to Flint, Michigan, overwhelmingly, African-American city that's obviously been impacted by this water crisis, suggesting that, once we get, this has been her theory all along, once we get beyond these overwhelmingly white liberal states of New Hampshire and Iowa and into places like South Carolina, into southern states or Midwestern states, Hillary Clinton, will do much better. And so I'm going to try to focus more attention on those issues rather than getting caught up in just the New Hampshire, Iowa-centric debate.
Olivia, it seemed to me it wasn't just a debate between two candidates, but between two sets of issues. I mean, Hillary Clinton, when she talked about foreign policy, her experience stood out. When Bernie Sanders talked about issues of inequality and the economy and so forth, he used that plain language that clearly appeals to young voters in particular.
Bernie's been talking about income inequality for 40 years. Yes, he's very clearly not only much more comfortable with the economic issues, but he's just better at it. People were remarking on his foreign policy comments last night as being a little bit wobbly, not demonstrating the kind of expertise that she has. But at the same time, it's not just these two sets of issues. It's also two radically different approaches. You have an argument between on foreign policy, you have Hillary Clinton arguing expertise and experience, and Bernie Sanders, arguing judgment He turns in on the 2002 vote to authorize the war in Iraq. You had that whole fight over, being an idealistic progressive versus someone who can get things done. It was a completely fascinating debate on all those different terrains, I thought.
Meanwhile, Gene, a lot of sort of after action talk about the Iowa caucuses on both sides. Bernie Sanders saying that he agreed with an editorial in the Des Moines Register that maybe those results on the Democratic side were questionable. And of course, we saw some questioning of the Iowa results on the part of the Republicans as well.
Yes. On the Democratic side, to be honest, I don't have much patience for those arguments. I mean, there are also reports that, Hillary's internal people were hand-wringing because they wanted a clear victory. That is so much the drama that Obama would not allow his campaign to go through. It's a W, okay? Move on. Ugly? Yeah. But Hillary might have to win this ugly if she's going to get to the nomination, because Bernie has the money, he has some momentum, and he can last. He can last deep into states. So if they, as much as they denied it, if they thought they were looking at a coronation, they aren't. And so, they just need to grit it out now. The Republican side, now there were outrageous things that happened on the Republican side. And
tell us about what Ted Cruz did, for example.
Oh, Cruz himself didn't do it; his people did it.
Right.
But news reports came out that Ben Carson was going to lead the campaign trail after Iowa and go. And
were there, in fact, news reports to that effect?
There were. Yeah, CNN reported it. And I think if a traditional campaign, a Rubio or one of these experienced guys, they would have glossed over this whole thing. But Ben Carson's not a traditional campaign. He just told it like it is. And he didn't just quietly leave the field and let people guess. He said, I'm going home for a little bit. So the word got out about that. But the real crime, or the real outrageousness, was starting with Steve King, a congressman in Iowa, tweeted before the caucuses began to their supporters, Carson is leaving the race, in effect. Know this before you vote for Cruz. And so, Mrs. Carson, representing her husband inside of one of the caucuses, was confronted by someone who said, but Carson is dropping out of the race. We're going to go with Cruz. And she was enormously frustrated because she couldn't convince him that no, it was just a small delay.
Amy, where did this rumor that he was going to actually drop out, not just leave Iowa, but actually drop out, come from?
Well, it was an assumption being made that if a candidate who needs to win Iowa or do well in Iowa, as Ben Carson does, if you take time off to to get fresh clothes, which literally was in the press release.
It started out as a CNN report saying that he was not going directly to New Hampshire. He was going to Florida for some R&R.
And fresh clothes.
The fresh clothes thing came
after that. Yes. So you make the assumption is not unrealistic, right? A candidate does not do particularly well. That candidate says, I'm taking time off, which is a nice euphemism for I'm going to drop out. As Rand Paul did pretty quickly afterwards, after Iowa, as Rick Santorum did pretty quickly after Iowa, after they both had poor results. But I think this, what's happening in Iowa, though, once again, reminds us what a ridiculous process Iowa is. This whole caucus system is a big hot mess. It is every 4 years. I feel I leave that place going, why is it that we do it this way? And we give them the first in the nation status, because there is always a problem. Always a problem.
Meanwhile, Olivia, bring us up to date on what's going on the Republican side. Debate on Saturday night, which I'm sure everyone will be looking forward to. And then the primary.
Oh, I get to be the first one to say the words Donald Trump on this program. Excellent, excellent. So I thought it was really interesting. Donald Trump is, stirring the pot and saying that Ted Cruz stole Iowa. And my sense, watching him from a distance, which probably is the best way to look at Donald Trump, is that he's trying to keep his supporters angry rather than dispirited by what happened in Iowa, and trying to keep them pumped up, because since he doesn't really have a turnout operation, he needs to rely on that kind of angry sentiment. You have Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, who are the other two in this. I mean, it's not quite a three-person race yet, but coming out of Iowa, it certainly looked like one. Ted Cruz is now with a win under his belt, is now happily going after Donald Trump, which he wasn't really doing very much before Iowa. And Marco Rubio is, I don't know if you want to call it surging, but he certainly seems to be getting a big.
Well, one poll shows him in second place.
Yeah,
our
poll released today has got him.
Has him in second place in New Hampshire or generally?
New Hampshire.
Okay, so he is doing better in the polls, and he seems to be going after the establishment vote in New Hampshire and beyond, which is why people like Chris Christie and Jeb Bush are going after him hard.
Olivia Knox, he is the chief Washington correspondent for Yahoo News. My other panelists are Amy Walter, national editor with Cook Political Report, and Gene Cummings from the Wall Street Journal. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to turn our attention to some other topics. We'll get back to political news later in the hour. Also, remember, you can watch us on live video at drshow.org. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Tom Gjelten of NPR. I'm sitting in for Diane Reed. This is the first hour of our Friday News Roundup. This is the hour where we discuss domestic news, and I have a all-star cast with me here in the studio. Gene Cummings, political and White House editor at the Wall Street Journal. Olivia Knox, chief Washington correspondent for Yahoo News. And Amy Walter, national editor with the Cook Political Report. Gene, it's the first Friday of the month of February, which means that we have the January jobs report. What caught your attention there?
Well, it's very mixed. The jobs are good, but not great. 150,000. Most economists thought it'd be 20, 30,000 higher, but wages did go up a little bit.
And wages is something that we've been watching very closely for the last couple of years.
Yeah, the lack of improvement on the wage front. Many people attribute to the consumer confidence staying low and the general frustration with people with the economy and where it's going. So it's a 12-cent increase in average hourly wages. So not huge, but a good indicator. You put those things together with lower gas prices, and some think that consumers could start to feel a little more comfortable about where the economy is going in the U.S. At the same time, as the New York Times reported today, the economy remains at risk and shaky because growth is good again, but not great. And there are other parts of the world that are slipping, and we are in a global market.
Olivia, do you sense any concern at the White House about the prospects of a recession? I mean, it's one thing to have these sort of periodic slowdowns. It's something else to have a full-fledged recession, especially in an election year.
Well, they're watching. Gene made a very good point about the global market, because the White House is looking very carefully at a slowdown in China, at trouble in Latin America, and at other and frankly at Europeans' stubbornly low growth, and is worried that the combination of all of these factors actually could be, I mean, the typical term is headwinds, but this is more than that. And they are very concerned that all these things could come together in one, in a economic storm situation, and could actually really hurt the American economy. They still say that they've handled the economy well. That's not very surprising. But they make the point that you could do everything right at home, and if a really big economy like China starts spiraling downward, it's still going to have an effect at home.
And just one quick note, what makes us particularly vulnerable is there are no tools left to respond.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
That and the fact that we never had a really robust recovery from the last slowdown. It was sort of, middling, right?
Yeah.
Amy, what do you think about, what does all this suggest or portend as far as the economy being once again a big issue this year?
Right. It's still a big issue,
Mm.
and it is always a driver of presidential elections. The interesting thing is that the president's numbers on handling the economy are as good as they've been in a long time. Certainly, if you go back to where things were in 2010 and even 2012, he's now people are pretty evenly divided on his handling of it. Where they've given him lower marks, of course, are on handling of terrorism, and that has been his weaker point at this point. But I think if you get a global slowdown, we've got potential for a big bubble bursting in the on credit, right? That's the issue in China. They're talking about $5 trillion of debt that is potentially devastating. And to Gene's point, that there are no tools left here. I guess in China, the government can always try to prop things up, but it is causing a slowdown in the rest of the world. And, for a lot of Americans who already feel as if they have been running in place for the last 10 years, the idea that things could actually get worse again would be devastating and absolutely drive the narrative of this campaign.
Well, speaking of narratives, every issue in an election year gets inflated because it is seen through this political lens. Islam and Muslims have been a really big issue, Gene, this year in the aftermath of the Paris and San Bernardino shootings. President Obama tried to address that by going for the first time in his presidency to a U.S. mosque this week. Tell us about that and what it meant.
Well, it was largely symbolic, but symbolism is important, especially when we're talking about something as hard to get your hands around as just prejudice and fear, and that's what we need to cope with in this situation. I mean, his message was a message we have heard, that he said, "You're not either a Muslim or an American. You are a Muslim and an American." And he urged tolerance, religious tolerance across the board. He spoke of Jewish Americans as well. So he urged broad tolerance, and then at the same time encouraged the Muslim community to help fight back against combating any domestic folks who may be turning. So it was a comprehensive message that hit on all points, and in an area where the president is particularly good at delivering this kind of message. What surprised me was the Republicans running for president attacked him for it, and it's a message of tolerance. Marco Rubio, in particular, was critical of the president delivering that speech. I don't know where the Republicans are going in this debate. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump took it to the extreme, and there were many who pushed back immediately against the things that Donald Trump proposed, including the ban on Muslim people coming into the country. But it surprised me that anybody would go back to that well, other than Donald Trump.
Well, that surprised me a little bit too, Gene. President Obama in that speech quoted President Eisenhower visiting the Islamic Center here in Washington and putting out a message that, religious freedom in America includes Islam. And of course, President George W. Bush, right after 9/11, said very similar things.
Mm-hmm.
So the sort of the politicization of this is a relatively new phenomenon. How do you explain it, Olivier?
If you look at the recent, there's a Pew survey out that shows that Republican voters have grown ever more hostile to Islam and Muslims, and I think that's part of it. You raised President Bush. He spent an enormous amount of time from about 5 days after the 9/11 attacks through his entire presidency, sending the message again and again and again and again that demonizing American Muslims is wrong. That first visit to the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., I think it was a 6-minute speech, and he said that Americans who scapegoat fellow Americans who are Muslim represent the worst of humankind. It was a very powerful message, and he delivered it throughout his administration. President Obama came into office, and to me, it looked like he was shifting the terrain for the conversation a little bit. He started talking to Muslims about America. That was the Cairo speech, the big outreach. But of late, I think in the last couple of years, he's shifted, and now he's talking to America about Muslims. And that's really what he was doing at the mosque, making that plea. White House aides don't typically like to say it's because of Donald Trump's message, but in private, they point directly to the political debate as forcing the president's hand, driving him to reaffirm American values like religious toleration.
And that's a message that he picked up, Amy, one day later, yesterday at the National Prayer Breakfast.
That's right. I was just about to say there's the similar message about tolerance and joining together as Americans. Don't let fear drive us, is what his message was as well at the prayer breakfast. But it is very clear, and you could see the difference between where the Republican primary is going and the Democratic primary is going. If you ask Democratic primary voters, most important issues to them, jobs, economy, #1 issue. For Republicans, it's security, it's terrorism, these issues playing very differently among Republicans. And fear is driving, and anxiety and anger is driving the Republican debate. And so those issues that the president's talking about don't let that become part of the the overall tenor for this country. Becomes very difficult to say that at a very polarized point, especially in politics. I think what we will see when we get to a general election is this will look quite different. It will be much harder, though, for Republicans who've been making the case about how dangerous the world that we live in is, to then suddenly pivot and say, well, okay, I'm going to be a little more open-minded.
Now, the prayer breakfast in the past has been a relatively non-political event. I think that changed. What was it in
with Ben Carson? Yeah.
2013, when Ben Carson stood up in front of President Obama and criticized his healthcare initiative. Interesting at a prayer breakfast. Yesterday, Paul Ryan spoke at the prayer breakfast and didn't give a overtly political message, but he did talk about prayer shaming, which is something that came up in the aftermath of the shootings in San Bernardino, when Democrats were criticizing Republicans for calling on Americans to pray as opposed to taking action on gun control. So there was sort of implicitly a political message there, wasn't there, Jane?
There definitely was. Paul Ryan, I don't want to take anything away from him. He practices his faith vigorously. And he's spoken of it before. And his point was, when you are praying, you indeed are doing something, that's not an idle act. And so he was pushing back against the notion that don't just pray, do something, that praying is doing something.
And that's a perfectly appropriate thing to say at the National Prayer Breakfast.
Yes.
Olivier, so Paul Ryan very delicately and tacitly criticized President Obama. Now, President Obama met with Paul Ryan and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell this week. This is the first time that I think that President Obama has met with Ryan since Ryan became Speaker. What are you seeing as far as sort of a different leadership style, different governing style, different political approach on the part of Paul Ryan? Is there anything that has sort of distinguished his style so far?
Well, at the end of last year, everyone was talking about how outgoing Speaker John Boehner had kind of opened a path for Speaker Ryan to work with the White House a little bit more, to feel less pressure from the right. And what we're actually seeing is that in this budget fight that's coming up, Paul Ryan's margin of maneuver has already shrunk. He's not John Boehner, that's for sure. The White House is still being very, very cautious about how they interact with him, and is looking to see whether he passes tests. And by what I mean by that is whether he can defy the right flank or not, and to what extent he can defy the right flank or not. And they're looking at this fight over the budget as a defining moment in Paul Ryan's leadership. Can he, in fact, buck the Freedom Caucus? Can he buck the Tea Party wing of the party? Which is an amazing thing, considering that the Paul Ryan budget itself was, in some ways, the blueprint for the current thinking in the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
Olivia Knox, he's the chief Washington correspondent for Yahoo News. I'm Tom Gjelten. I'm sitting in for Diane Rehm. This is the Diane Rehm Show. And remember, you can call us and join our conversation, 1-800-433-8850. You can email us, drshow@wamu.org. Amy, I'm curious about your sort of assessment of what's going on Capitol Hill on the Republican side. Mitch McConnell was in that meeting with President Obama this week. Now, Mitch McConnell himself has come under very sharp attack from the sort of the Ted Cruz wing of the Republican electorate. What are you seeing in terms of the dynamic on Capitol Hill among Republicans themselves?
Right. Mitch McConnell's in a very difficult position because on the one hand, he is getting pressure from the Ted Cruz wing of the party to fight harder against President Obama. There was a lot of talk late last year, and you still hear it in conservative circles, about using the so-called nuclear option, basically saying, don't let the president get away with this stuff, get away with cloture votes, use your majority to actually put the president on the defensive. McConnell's been very reticent to do that, saying it sets a precedent. That's not going to do us very much good. If we're in the minority, we don't want to do that sort of thing. He's also, though, getting pressure from his more moderate members. Remember, this is, of course, an election year. And in 2016, Republicans have a lot of vulnerable Senate seats at stake in swing states, some very blue states like Illinois, Wisconsin. And those members are looking at the possibility of either a top of a ticket, that if it's, for example, Donald Trump, which creates a whole lot of angst for them, and the frustration bubbling among so many voters about a dysfunctional Washington. So they'd be fighting those two pressures too. So McConnell trying to figure out, how do you look like you're standing up to President Obama, but also how do you give your more moderate members from swing states an opportunity to show that they're getting something done and they're not just obstructionists.
Now, what's your reading that yesterday, I think it was, the Democrats in the U.S. Senate blocked a energy bill that it was a bipartisan energy bill, and it looked like it was going to pass, but they were asking for money to address the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and that blocked passage of the bill. How significant was that?
Well, it's the Republicans are going to hold firm on money. That's just Mitch McConnell has been really very clear about this, and he was yesterday after the White House meeting, that they're not going to bail out Puerto Rico, which has a lot of financial problems right now, and so are there ways to help Flint without throwing money at it? The Republicans might consider that, but that is one area where I think he's drawn a bright line. Now, to those members, though, that want to show they are getting things done, there were a couple of things that were discussed at the White House, chief among them being the reform of the criminal justice system, that actually has a decent shot at passing, because support for that kind of change stems from President Obama to the Koch brothers to Rand Paul. I mean, it's got this huge, broad coalition pushing for it. And so that could be something that the senators then could run on and feel like, they could say that they passed something.
Olivia, we have to talk a little bit more about this, the awful situation in Flint, Michigan. Now, Hillary Clinton is going to go to Flint. Is it on Sunday, I believe? And it shows how seriously people are taking this on a national basis and not just in Michigan itself.
Absolutely, and it wraps up all these interesting issues of of American poverty, of the fate of a predominantly African American city, of environmental regulation, of the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. This is it touches every level of American politics, and for Hillary Clinton, this is it's a big issue for Democrats across the board, but it's a big issue for Hillary Clinton. I think Amy mentioned this before. She's looking past these early fairly uniform states to the more diverse voter population of the of states beyond the New Hampshire contest. She's going to be making a case for an activist response to this crisis, and we're sort of still trying to see how Bernie Sanders is going to respond to this. But it touches every single level of government and of policy, and that's one of the reasons it's been. I mean. And I should add, as a parent, obviously, it's touching every American in the sense of you wouldn't want your kids.
It's tragic.
It's,
I mean, you watch
tragic.
the footage of people filling up a glass from their taps, and the water is this sort of pale yellow, and it's visceral.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to go to the phone calls, which are lining up. I'm Tom Gjelten. This is the Diane Rehm Show. Stay tuned. Hello again. I'm Tom Gjelten from NPR, and I'm sitting in for your regular host, Diane Rehm. Today in the Friday News Roundup, we're talking about the domestic news of the week with Gene Cummings from the Wall Street Journal, Levy Knox from Yahoo News, and Amy Walter with the Cook Political Report. And you know what? I'm going to go straight to the phones here, starting with Thomasina, who is on the line from Florida. Thomasina, thanks for calling the Diane Rehm Show.
Yes, thanks for taking my call. Watched the debate last night. Body language can reveal a lot during a debate. And Hillary has a characteristic of nodding her head when she's making a point or agreeing with someone. During last night's debate, Bernie talked about the poisoned water in Flint and the terrible impact on mostly black children. Hillary enthusiastically nodded her head, constantly in agreement. But when Bernie said, and I quote, "I suspect Hillary would agree that action would have come sooner if Flint were a wealthy white area," Hillary immediately stopped nodding her head. I wonder what message that sent to her African-American supporters.
Did anyone else notice that?
I didn't really notice that. I mean, she's right that Hillary does have a habit of doing that, but I'm I guess I didn't notice that she stopped. But if she did, it might have been the idea of injecting race. I mean, this is a tragedy.
Right.
And I mean, these parents know their children have been poisoned and there is nothing they can do about it. And I don't care what color they are, they're parents. It's awful. But, I don't know if, I think Hillary has strong and enduring ties with the African American community. She is spoken out very forcefully on this issue. I mean, there's no ambiguity about the horror that she sees there and the fact that she thinks the government should step in and help those people.
Right. And as we mentioned before, she's actually going to go there in the next few days.
And the Democratic debate now is going to be there.
Exactly.
Yeah, the new debate.
Now, Thomasina has already hung up. She called from Florida, and I actually was going to ask her about the Zika virus, which has made its presence known in Florida. We actually had the governor of Florida, Rick Scott, declaring a state of emergency. Now he's extended that to 5 counties after the discovery of Zika virus cases there. This is starting to take on some worrisome dimensions, isn't it, Olivier?
Absolutely. The White House has taken pains to say that for most people, Zika virus symptoms are actually pretty mild. But the problem is that the people for whom it's worst are pregnant women. Yeah. Right. It's linked to birth defects. It's not quite. We're not quite seeing the same response as we did to Ebola, but it's taking on some worrisome aspects, including the fact that now they're looking at transmission vectors beyond just mosquito bites. They're looking at the possibility of sexually transmitted Zika virus, transmitted through saliva and other means. That hasn't been conclusively demonstrated yet. But yes, it's getting worrisome. And in a time when we all travel everywhere, there's no reason to think it's not going to keep spreading.
Well, and if it will become, I think, a more pronounced issue and people will start talking about more and probably freaking out about it more if we have a case of this microencephalitis here. And the first case of that, it will be on the news. And then I think it will turn into a big, very big issue very, very quickly.
Or even just a government official saying to women, don't get pregnant for the next couple of years, right? Which was
if you plan on going, if you were you say, well, I'm not going to a Latin American country, I should be okay. Oh, actually, if you live anywhere in Florida or Texas or Louisiana, that's getting to be some serious concern.
Well, one of the things that Governor Scott said is that the particular mosquito that spreads the Zika virus is actually quite prevalent in Florida. So we're not talking
That's what I mean. You
about,
don't have to go to a country in Central America. You don't have to go to Brazil in order to be bitten by this.
Yeah. Let's go now to Brian, who is on the line from Michigan. Hello, Brian. Thanks for calling the Diane Rehm Show.
Hello, Tom and guest. Thank you for taking my call. I have a comment and a question. My comment is the plumber protects the health of the nation, and America needs to know that plumbers do more than all the doctors and nurses do to ensure healthy living and longer lives. That said, about the Flint water crisis, my question is, how is it that one of Michigan Governor Rick Schneider's top aides knew about the Legionella outbreak from the water, the Legionnaire outbreak from the water shift 10 months before the governor report he knew it?
Does anyone know about the history of the Legionnaire's outbreak? Jean.
It definitely was a precursor to and should have been a flag. But as people have been reporting this and investigations are going to go on for a while, I think what we're going to discover is that there were all kinds of moments that were missed right from the very beginning. I was listening to an interview on this program with the doctor and who first started raising the alarms, and was really shocked to hear on that program that what made her go look to see what the lead levels were in the children was that she was having a casual conversation one night with a girlfriend who used to work at the EPA. And so it was just a passing conversation that started to expose all of this. So we have a lot to learn about this.
We do indeed. And I think it's just going to get bigger and bigger because, as we have been saying, this is an issue that every parent every parent can relate to.
Yeah.
I want to read a couple of emails that we've gotten, and then we'll go back to the calls. Greg writes, he's talking about the National Prayer Breakfast. When I heard Paul Ryan speak about prayer as action in itself, I'd like to remind him of the scripture in Matthew's Gospel of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting those in prison. Those actions speak louder than words, and that Catholic tradition, especially as a practicing Catholic, he should know the long tradition of the Catholic Church putting prayer into action and not just speaking words. Amy, or
yeah, and to Paul Ryan's credit, he has tried to make that the centerpiece, and in fact, a lot of people talking about Paul Ryan as being sort of the next iteration of Jack Kemp, who was known as the Republican focused on poverty and issues in that realm, and that is what Paul Ryan would argue, that absolutely we have to address these issues. But just because I have a different way of addressing those than Democrats do doesn't make me wrong, number one, or our party wrong, and doesn't mean that one person has the correct way to handle this. We as Republicans, I as Paul Ryan, he would say, think that this is very important, but I'm going to go about it in a very different way than many Democrats will.
Olivia, the one Republican candidate who really talks often about poor people and about the responsibility of public officials to think about issues of poverty is John Kasich, and he's been doing that in New Hampshire. This could be his last stand. We're going to see whether that message resonates with Republican voters in New Hampshire.
We are. We're also going to see whether John Kasich can sort of elbow out his rivals for the establishment lane of the nominating process. The other person who was doing that until he dropped out of the race was Rand Paul, who of course traveled to a lot of African-American neighborhoods and was talking that up. There is a tradition in the Republican Party of having some of those kinds of candidates, those kinds of public officials, because John Kasich, of course, governor of Ohio. I want to go back to the Paul Ryan thing. He was directly addressing a wave of sentiment in the aftermath of San Bernardino, in which liberals and Democrats said, you can, take your thoughts and prayers. We want action on guns. He was specifically responding to that. I don't think he was laying out his comprehensive philosophy of government action.
Let's go now to Jane, who's on the line from Delaware. Hello, Jane. Thanks for calling us here on the Diane Rehm Show.
Oh, thanks for taking my call. I want to know why Bernie Sanders is not attacking Hillary about the Clinton Foundation when she was Secretary of State. There's a book called The Clinton Cash that everybody ought to read, but there was supposed to be something in place while she was Secretary of State to make sure there was no conflict of interest, and yet there seems to be a lot of shady stuff there. Why isn't Bernie going down that road?
Gene Cummings?
Well, first of all, I think it's really it's a complicated argument to make, and Bernie is going after her for her Wall Street donations and her speaking fees, which are in the vein of the donations to the foundation, but they're a lot easier to understand. I thought last night that Hillary Clinton came up finally after 3 tries with a strong response, basically saying just his assumption is if you take a donation, you've been bought, and that she rejects that. I think the response would be similarly to the foundation donations. But Jane is right. There are, we at the Wall Street Journal have done a lot of reporting on this. There are major corporations. There are, foreign countries who were seeking things from the government who, the timing of when they were asking coincided with big donations to the foundation.
And I think there's a bigger issue here too, which is that Bernie Sanders fundamentally does not attack Hillary Clinton on some of her biggest vulnerabilities.
That's one,
and the emails. And he has made a point of, to Gene's point, yes, making claims about Wall Street and getting Wall Street money, and can you really be tough on Wall Street if you're getting money from them, but never going directly at Hillary Clinton, asking her directly, did this influence you, or I think this influenced you, and saying, bottom line, Hillary Clinton has trust and honesty issues that show up in general election polls. A whole bunch of independent voters feel this way. As a general election candidate, she will be very vulnerable to those charges. That is an argument that he is just not willing to make. And there are a whole bunch of Bernie Sanders supporters, including many in his campaign orbit, who wish he would, but it looks as if he's not going to take that.
Amy Walter from the Cook Political Report. I'm Tom Gjelten. You're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. So, Amy, do you think this means that in the back of his mind, Bernie Sanders thinks that he may not and probably won't be the Democratic nominee and does not want to weaken her position, is enough of a loyal Democrat that he doesn't want to weaken her potential position in a general election?
Well, it's funny because he's not really a loyal Democrat, right? He has been an independent for his entire political career. This is the first time that he has joined forces. Clearly, the Democratic Party has not been very helpful to him, both in the way that they set up the debate schedule, just the way that the system works. It's definitely leaning heavily toward the establishment Democrat and benefiting the establishment Democrat. So there's no love lost there or any loyalty there. I think for Bernie Sanders, it is just fundamentally kind of who he is. And he came into this race as an incredible underdog. He wanted to inject the issue of income inequality into this debate, which he has. He has, on issues, helped to push Hillary Clinton to the left. And that is incredibly so he's been incredibly successful already there. And if the way to win is to get into a sword fight with Hillary Clinton, or if you want to bring guns and flamethrowers and everything, he will, not only does he not like to do that, but the flack that he will get back will be intense.
You know, each of the callers that we have on the board right now wants to talk about Hillary. I don't know what that means, but let's give Sarah the first crack at that, calling from Virginia. Hello, Sarah.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I get a lot of other women telling me that they're going to support Hillary Clinton just because we're women, and I'm thinking that's just not good enough. And I don't trust Hillary Clinton.
Why not, Sarah?
I think there's a lot of hidden corruption with her, just like the previous caller said. And there's a lot of, I just don't feel like I don't trust her. And I wanted to know more. Like, why don't the candidates say, especially the ones who've been in public office for so long, why don't they talk more about their achievements? Like, what have they actually done for this country? Have they created jobs? Have they helped the average American? It just seems like a popularity contest, especially with the position and Trump. It's more like who can insult Muslims more and get more popularity. This is not about bullying. This is about being the highest office in the United States of America and
So,
how
Sarah,
to make it better.
So it sounds like you're disappointed with everybody in this race. Do you have a preferred candidate?
Well, I was thinking about Sanders, but then I didn't do research, and it said that he voted against the war, but he voted for the funding. So I wish we had more qualified candidates, but since it's all about popularity and who can raise money.
Yeah. Jean?
Well, I can understand, and I'm sure other voters are in the same boat with her in terms of looking for a candidate who has a clean message and that matches right up with their record. It's tough. It's tough. We've got a lot of candidates out there. There are some who are talking about their records. John Kasich is. The governors are talking about that on the Republican side. So Jeb Bush based everything on his 2 terms as governor of Florida. He thought that was his ticket in. And I found it amazingly telling at an Iowa town hall. They had put out papers on all of the tables that had his record in Florida. And a woman picked it up, looked at it and said, I don't care what he did as governor. I want to know what he's going to do for me now. And so that message is just not gaining traction this year.
Well, Olivier, if voters wish they had more choices, they must be disappointed at the way that candidates have been dropping out, not dropping into this race.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, Sarah did sound a little bit like a Sanders supporter even before you explicitly got her on there. I mean, right. So we need someone who will agree with Americans that the system is rigged against them in some fashion, not getting the job done in some fashion, but who has a record and who has ideas for the future. And yeah, I could see why there'd be some frustration with the 2016 field. I mean, we've had, especially in some of these debates, we've had sort of insult fests.
Well, the Democratic side has really been much more policy oriented, but they're really unique characters, the two of them. You have Bernie Sanders, who's basically been an outsider in the Senate for a couple of decades, who has not a lot of legislative big victories to point to because of the kind of role he played in the Senate. And then you got a former Secretary of State, where again, you're not going to get the kind of record that the voters might be looking for.
Amy, I'm going to give you the last word.
I had something really important that
Trenchant.
I wanted to
We're
say.
waiting.
No, but I think that, listen, there are a lot of choices in this race. I actually disagree a little bit here with the caller, only in that, especially if you look on the Republican side, there are many points of view here on where the country should go and the kind of role that the country should play both internationally and domestically. You may not agree with all of them, but there are a whole bunch of choices out there.
Amy Walter is the national editor with Cook Political Report. I'd like to thank her and my other two panelists, Gene Cummings from the Wall Street Journal and Olivia Knox, Chief Washington Correspondent for Yahoo News. And thanks to all our callers. I'm Tom Gjelten. This is the Diane Rehm Show.